Beneath the western Pacific lies a fissure that completely shatters the human scale. At more than 10 kilometers deep, the Mariana Trench opens like a dark gash in the Earth's crust, a place where the pressure is so brutal that the human body would be destroyed in an instant, and where, for a long time, science believed that life simply could not exist. For decades, what we knew about that world buried beneath the water were little more than scattered data, cold numbers in a logbook, and echoes returned by instruments that never truly saw the bottom. To understand how we even came to sense the existence of this abyss, we must go back to a time when the deep ocean was practically a blank space. In the 1870s, the Royal Navy ship HMS Challenger set sail on what is now considered the first great global study of the oceans. It was not a heroic expedition in the classical sense, but rather meticulous and repetitive work, measuring depths, taking samples, recording temperatures and currents. Each depth measurement was a test of patience and physical endurance. A lead weight tied to a long rope was lowered over the side and vanished into the darkness. Then all that weight had to be hauled back up by hand, mark by mark, while the ship rolled under the tropical sun or through cutting winds in colder latitudes. Most of the figures always told the same story: a vast and relatively uniform ocean floor, carpeted with muds and sediments about 3 or 4 kilometers below the surface. The deep ocean appeared as an immense, monotonous and silent plain, but in a remote region of the western Pacific, thousands of kilometers from Japan and far from any coast, one routine measurement ceased to be routine. The rope descended 1 kilometer, then 2, then 3. It kept going down, 4, 5, 6 kilometers, and the weight continued sinking without touching bottom. On deck, the sailors kept paying out line while the hull creaked softly above a void of which no one had a clear image, only the intuition of something immense and unknown beneath their feet. At that time, sailing far from land already involved countless risks: storms capable of destroying a ship, invisible reefs, irreparable breakdowns far from any port. Added to this was the fear of what could not be seen. Tales of sea monsters with gigantic tentacles were not merely superstition. They were a way of giving shape to ignorance. The depths were imagined as a hostile space, full of impossible creatures and unknown forces. In that context, lowering a rope into an abyss that seemed to have no end must have been as unsettling as it was fascinating. After a long wait, the lead weight finally touched bottom. When they calculated the depth, they obtained an extraordinary figure: 4,475 fathoms, a little more than 8 kilometers below the surface. Never before had such a number been recorded. That point was marked on maps with a name that would become legendary: Challenger Deep. The Challenger Deep, in honor of the ship that had revealed the most awe-inspiring fissure on the planet. At the time, no one knew that this measurement did not even reach the true center of the abyss. Many decades later, when technology made it possible to use sonar and other remote measuring instruments, scientists returned to the region. This time, they no longer relied on a rope and a lead weight, but on sound pulses that bounced off the seabed and returned loaded with information. The new data showed that the Challenger's first measurement had only grazed the edge of an even deeper depression. The true lowest point of the Mariana Trench lies at almost 11 kilometers below sea level. If Mount Everest, with its approximately 8.8 kilometers of height, were placed at the bottom of the trench, its summit would still remain submerged beneath nearly 2 kilometers of water. The trench is not an isolated pit, but an elongated and curved structure that follows the western edge of the Pacific. In its widest sections, it reaches nearly 70 kilometers in width. One of its flanks drops like an almost vertical wall. The other slopes more gently until it merges with the abyssal plains. Challenger Deep, despite being only a small section within this gigantic scar, could hold dozens of skyscrapers stacked one on top of another without even reaching the ocean's surface. Seen from space, Earth appears to be a relatively uniform water planet, but beneath that blue surface lies a topography as extreme as that of any continental mountain range. The origin of this fissure is not a random fracture, but the slow and constant movement of the Earth's crust. The outer part of the planet is not a single solid layer, but a mosaic of enormous tectonic plates that move a few centimeters per year over the hotter and more plastic mantle beneath. In places where the plates separate, magma rises, cools, and forms new oceanic crust. There, the sea floor is manufactured. By contrast, where the plates meet and collide, the crust cannot continue to accumulate without limit, and one of the pieces must give way. Along many ocean margins, the older and colder plate sinks beneath a lighter one. That plate bends, cracks, and begins a slow descent toward the Earth's interior. This is the process of subduction, responsible for the deepest ocean trenches on the planet. Every time a plate bends and sinks beneath another, the surface leaves a clear mark, a long and narrow trench that signals the point where the crust begins its fall back into the mantle. In the case of the Mariana Trench, the main actor is the Pacific Plate, one of the largest and densest on Earth. For tens of millions of years, it has moved westward, slowly pushing its own crust toward the boundary where it meets the smaller and lighter Philippine Plate. Along that boundary lies the volcanic arc of the Mariana Islands. There, the Pacific Plate does not manage to push the islands outward. Instead, it bends and slides beneath the neighboring plate. At that turning point, where solid rock bends on a planetary scale, the trench is born, a colossal fold carved into the base of the ocean. This pattern of subduction is not exclusive to the Marianas. Skirting the Pacific, other plate boundaries show the same dynamics, and together draw on maps a great ring of trenches, island arcs, and volcanic chains known as the Ring of Fire. Nearly 90% of the planet's earthquakes and roughly 3/4 of its active volcanoes are concentrated there. Within that belt, the Mariana Trench represents one of the most extreme and clearest examples of the power with which tectonics can reshape the surface of the Earth. Understanding how the Mariana Trench formed is only half of the problem. The other half begins when someone tries to physically reach its bottom. At nearly 11 kilometers deep, the true enemy is not darkness or distance, but an invisible force that permeates everything: pressure. It can already be felt in something as ordinary as the bottom of a swimming pool. Just a few meters below the surface, the ears clog and the chest senses a slight additional weight. At 10 meters, the pressure has doubled compared to sea level. If that same logic is extended to the scale of Challenger Deep, the numbers cease to be intuitive and become extreme. At the deepest point of the trench, the column of water rising above generates a pressure more than 1,000 times greater than atmospheric pressure, on the order of tens of thousands of psi. Under those conditions, any object that has not been designed with a huge safety margin runs the risk of collapsing suddenly. The smallest structural weakness, an imperfect weld, a bolt that was not properly calculated, can become the origin of a catastrophic failure. Even equipment specifically designed for the deep ocean has proven to be vulnerable. In 2014, an unmanned research vehicle exploring the Kermadec Trench at nearly 9,900 meters abruptly lost contact. The signal was cut off, no more data were received, and all that was later recovered were scattered fragments of the machine. The pressure had easily found the weak point. The comparison with modern military submarines is revealing. These vessels, built to operate in wartime scenarios, usually work safely at only a few hundred meters of depth. Even the deepest diving models have strict limits well before reaching a kilometer. Beyond those depths, the risk of structural failure increases exponentially. Challenger Deep, by contrast, descends almost 11,000 meters below the surface, an environment completely beyond the reach of any existing naval submarine. Reinforcing the hull is not enough. It is necessary to conceive a completely different type of vehicle, designed from the outset to withstand a pressure that mercilessly crushes anything that is not prepared. In that context, a solution emerged that was as simple in concept as it was extreme in execution: the bathyscaphe. In the late 1950s, the Swiss engineer Auguste Piccard developed the Trieste, a vehicle that combined two key elements. In the lower part, a thick-walled steel sphere barely large enough for two people to sit cramped inside. That small bubble would be the only habitable space, pressurized to surface level. Above it, a massive float filled with gasoline. The choice was not accidental. Gasoline, less dense than water and only slightly compressible, provided buoyancy even under extreme pressures. Between the sphere and the float was a supporting structure to which iron ballast tanks were attached. The operating principle was straightforward. The bathyscaphe was ballasted to sink, and once on the bottom, released part of that weight in order to rise again. There was no sophisticated propulsion system and no major comforts. It was, in essence, a strong sphere hanging from a floating tank. Everything else was patience, calculation, and a good measure of trust that the equations guiding the design were correct. In 1960, two men sat inside that sphere to carry out a dive that would mark a turning point. Don Walsh, a lieutenant in the United States Navy, and Jacques Piccard, a Swiss oceanographer and son of the vehicle's designer, began the descent toward the deepest point on Earth. Once the hatch was sealed, the sphere was cut off from the outside world. There was no room to stand up. They could only look through small glass windows whose integrity depended on no microcrack becoming a lethal problem. As the Trieste began to sink, the sea at the surface faded into a distant memory. The journey toward the bottom was not fast. As depth increased, temperature dropped and pressure rose in a continuous gradient. Inside the sphere, Walsh and Piccard watched the numbers on the depth gauge advance. 1,000 meters, 5,000, 8,000. Each number represented another layer of water pressing down on the steel hull. There was no possibility of opening a hatch, of immediately turning back, of aborting the descent in any conventional sense. The only option was to trust that the structure would hold until reaching the bottom. Near 9 kilometers, a sudden bang violently shook the craft. The sharp explosive sound echoed like a gunshot inside the narrow cabin. For a few moments, any theoretical calculation must have been eclipsed by the primitive sensation of being crushed. It would later be discovered that an external plexiglass plate installed as additional protection had cracked under the pressure. The main cabin, however, remained intact. The descent continued. After nearly 5 hours of descent, the Trieste finally touched the bottom of Challenger Deep. The impact stirred up a cloud of extremely fine sediment that clouded the water in front of the small windows. For a few moments, only a kind of milky haze could be perceived, a liquid dust suspended in the darkness. When that cloud began to dissipate, the scene that emerged was not that of a completely dead mineral desert. According to Piccard's account, a creature resembling a flat fish about 30 centimeters long was moving across the seabed. Seen through a window only a few centimeters thick and under enormous pressure, the observation was necessarily limited, but sufficient to draw a decisive conclusion. Even at the deepest known point, life was present. Walsh and Piccard remained on the bottom for about 20 minutes. They could not travel great distances or perform complex maneuvers. The main mission was not to map the trench, but to demonstrate that it was possible to reach it alive and return safely. After that brief interval in the most extreme place in the ocean, they released the ballast and began the ascent. The return to the surface took about 3 more hours, crossing in reverse the layers of water that separated them from air and light. When they finally surfaced, they had not only set a historic record, they had forced science to reconsider the idea that life could not withstand such high pressures. Paradoxically, the success of the Trieste was also a kind of endpoint. The dive proved that the journey was possible, but it also made clear that the level of risk and the technical difficulties were enormous. For more than half a century, while humanity conquered the summit of Everest and reached the moon, the bottom of the Mariana Trench remained practically untouched. No human being set foot in Challenger Deep again for decades. It was not until 2012 that the second crewed dive to the bottom took place. This time the protagonist was James Cameron, aboard the modern submersible deep-sea Challenger. Unlike the Trieste, his vehicle incorporated composite materials technology, advanced electronic systems, high-definition cameras, and the ability to collect samples from the seabed. Cameron descended alone, becoming the third person to reach the deepest point of the ocean. His journey not only provided new images and data, but also revived interest in the exploration of abyssal trenches and demonstrated that dives could be repeated with a more scientific and systematic approach. From that point on, a new generation of submersibles and expeditions began to visit the abyss. By the beginning of the decade of the 2020s, more than 20 people had descended to Challenger Deep, surpassing the total accumulated over the previous 50 years. Among those expedition members were explorers such as Victor Vescovo and Hamish Harding, who went on to set records for operational time on the bottom, carrying out multiple descents and collecting increasingly dense data sets. However, each dive remains a large-scale operation. It requires years of design and construction, exhaustive testing of every component, support ships equipped with cranes, laboratories, redundant communication systems, and highly specialized human teams. A failure in a valve or an electrical connection can mean the loss of the vehicle, the data, and in the worst case, human lives. Even today, when submersibles capable of repeatedly visiting the abyss already exist, the total number of hours humanity has spent on the floor of the trench is insignificant compared with the immensity of the place. Each descent offers only a fragmentary glimpse of a world that remains, for the most part, unknown. Above the Mariana Trench, the surface of the Pacific appears as an endless sheet of water, with no coasts in sight and no reference points. Everything is horizon, but it only takes leaving that surface for the ocean to cease being a uniform volume and reveal itself as a stratified space, divided into well-defined layers, each with its own light, its own pressure, and its own forms of life. The first of these layers is the epipelagic zone, the luminous skin of the ocean. It extends from the surface down to about 200 meters in depth. It is a relatively thin band when compared with the immensity of the sea, but it concentrates the most decisive role for life on the planet. It is the only part of the ocean where sunlight is intense enough to sustain photosynthesis. Here, billions of tiny organisms, phytoplankton and microscopic algae, convert sunlight, dissolved carbon dioxide, and nutrients into organic matter and oxygen. Nearly half of the oxygen present in Earth's atmosphere is generated in this seemingly insignificant layer of water. Phytoplankton becomes food for zooplankton, small creatures that drift with the currents, copepods, crustacean larvae, tiny jellyfish. In turn, this zooplankton is eaten by small fish and larger jellyfish. They feed bigger predators such as pelagic fish, squid, and sharks. In this way, the marine food chain rises from its microscopic base just beneath the sunlight. Life in the depths depends to a large extent on the productivity of this surface band. Remains of organisms, feces, tissue fragments, and aggregates of organic matter slowly sink like a dark rain, a marine snow that nourishes the lower levels of the ocean. As one descends from the surface, colors begin to fade. Reds disappear first, then oranges and yellows until only a deep blue filtered by the water remains. Around 200 meters, even that blue becomes faint. Here, the epipelagic zone ends, and the mesopelagic zone, also called the twilight zone, begins. Light from above still exists, but it is so weak that it no longer allows photosynthesis. Temperature drops rapidly and pressure begins to increase more noticeably. In this constant semi-darkness, the first flashes ignite, green and blue bursts of bioluminescence that emerge from the organisms themselves and cut through the gloom in brief pulses of light. Despite its apparent darkness, the mesopelagic zone is extraordinarily rich in life. Some estimates suggest that the biomass of fish living in this band exceeds that of the entire rest of the ocean combined. Here, immense schools of lanternfish are found, animals that during the day remain hundreds of meters deep and at night rise in massive vertical migrations to feed in shallower waters. That daily migration, hundreds of meters up and down, is one of the largest collective animal movements on Earth, even though it is almost never visible to the human eye. When roughly 1,000 meters of depth is passed, sunlight disappears completely. There is no difference between day and night. One enters the bathypelagic zone, also known as the midnight zone or twilight zone. Temperature stabilizes at just a few degrees above freezing, while pressure reaches values hundreds of times greater than at the surface. Conventional submarines can no longer operate here. Their hulls are not designed to withstand such a load. And yet this place is not an uninhabited void. In absolute darkness, flashes of bioluminescence multiply. Jellyfish, squid, fish, crustaceans, and worms turn the ocean into an inverted sky, filled with moving points of light. The band of water between 1,000 and 4,000 meters constitutes the largest continuous habitable environment on the planet. Its inhabitants have shaped their bodies and behaviors to survive under conditions a human could not endure. Their skeletons are light, sometimes reduced to minimal structures. Their tissues are flexible and adapted to pressure. Their metabolisms have slowed to save energy in a world where food is scarce and arrives irregularly. The senses are reinvented as well. Gigantic eyes optimized to capture the faintest trace of light, organs sensitive to pressure, antennae and tentacles that probe the water in search of chemical or mechanical signals. In this dark realm, light becomes an essential tool. Some fish have developed astonishing eyes. The barrel-eye fish, for example, has a transparent skull that functions like a dome. Through it, its tubular eyes can rotate and look upward, searching for silhouettes outlined against the faint glow that filters down from higher layers. Other predators use light not only to see, but to lure. The deep-sea anglerfish holds a bioluminescent filament above its head, a small lantern that floats like a glowing worm. When prey approaches, drawn to that single point of light in total darkness, it suddenly finds itself facing jaws filled with long, sharp teeth. The deep-sea dragonfish, for its part, emits light along its body, creating a luminous outline that serves to confuse and entice its prey before it lunges. Lower down, in even quieter sectors of this zone, the long-armed squid hangs in the water. Its central body is small, but its tentacles unfold like extremely fine threads that descend vertically for many meters into the darkness. It remains almost motionless, with its arms extended like a net of sensors waiting for the slightest touch of prey. From time to time, deep-sea cameras have managed to capture its ghostly silhouette, floating motionless in the water, as if it were an inverted kite attached to nothing. Even stranger is the siphonophore, one of the most bewildering creatures of the deep ocean. At first glance, it looks like an elongated jellyfish, with some species exceeding 40 meters in length, longer than a blue whale. But it is not a single organism, it is a colony, a chain of genetically identical units, each specialized in a specific function, such as propulsion, prey capture, or digestion. Together, they form a collective body that drifts slowly through the darkness, often emitting light along its entire structure. When a giant siphonophore coils in on itself in the depths, it traces undulating, luminous patterns that seem detached from any earthly reference. Beyond roughly 6,000 meters in depth, an almost invisible threshold is crossed. The bathypelagic domain ends and the Hadal zone begins, the exclusive territory of the Great Ocean Trenches. Here, the water hovers just about 1 degree above freezing, and the pressure approaches 1,000 times atmospheric pressure. Every square centimeter of any surface receives a force that, on a human scale, would be inconceivable. Even so, the Hadal zone is not completely isolated. Along the trench floor flow currents of very cold, dense water that sank in polar regions and have slowly crossed half the planet before reaching this point. These deep water masses carried dissolved oxygen with them, maintaining a minimal level of habitability even in the most extreme corners of the ocean. That slow and silent circulation is the thread that connects the abyss with the rest of the Earth system. In a place where light never arrives, life can no longer depend exclusively on food falling from the surface. Marine snow remains important, but it is not enough. In some areas of the seabed, seepages appear of fluids rich in chemical compounds such as hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other reduced elements that escape from the oceanic crust and upper mantle. There, communities of microorganisms use these compounds as an energy source, transforming inorganic matter into biomass through chemosynthesis. It is a process analogous to photosynthesis, but powered by chemical energy instead of sunlight. Far less efficient, yes, but sufficient to sustain small food webs in an environment where every resource counts. On this microscopic base, discrete communities are built, almost invisible on a human scale. Among the most characteristic inhabitants of the hadal zone of the Marianas are snailfish, small animals with soft bodies, milky white coloration and minimal bone structure. Their gelatinous tissues and reduced skeletons are extreme adaptations to crushing pressure. By reducing rigid parts, the risk of fractures and internal collapse decreases. In the Mariana Trench, snailfish have been recorded at depths close to 8,000 meters, moving gently along the bottom and between the walls of the underwater valley. However, below approximately 8,200 meters, no living bony fish has ever been observed. That depth marks, as far as is known, the final biological boundary for this group in the deep ocean. It is believed that beyond this limit, pressure alters the proteins and cell membranes of vertebrates to such a degree that their physiology ceases to function. What for humans is just a number becomes, for marine life, an invisible wall, a depth range that some lineages have managed to conquer and others have not. At the very bottom of Challenger Deep, where the trench reaches its maximum depths, life seems to shed any excess. Large fish disappear. Complex bodies become rare, and the ecosystem appears simplified almost to the point of being reduced to microorganisms and a few specialized invertebrates. Among the latter, amphipods stand out, small crustaceans with a fragile appearance but extraordinary resilience. Baited observation cameras have recorded swarms of these animals rushing toward food within minutes, demonstrating that even in the most remote abyss, an opportunity to feed is never wasted. Nevertheless, the amphipods visible around the bait tell only part of the story. The most common method for observing life in trenches consists precisely of dropping cameras to the bottom along with bait, waiting a few hours, and recovering the equipment. This means that most of the images obtained show a small patch of terrain artificially illuminated and a community filtered by the type of food offered. It is known that scavenging crustaceans quickly gather around this free resource, but that does not mean they are the only inhabitants of the place. They are simply the ones that react to the available stimulus during the brief interval in which the lights remain on. More discreet, pressed against the substrate itself, are perhaps the strangest organisms in the entire abyss, xenophyophories. At first glance, they look like shapeless stains, gelatinous masses coated with mud and attached to rocks or sediment. But each of those structures corresponds to a single giant cell, capable of reaching the size of a human fist. To build their fragile shells, these organisms cement together tiny sediment particles, mineral fragments, and remains of other living beings. They then filter from the water the smallest organic particles, which make up their food. The interest xenophyophories generate goes far beyond simple biological curiosity. Their ability to keep cell membranes functional, flexible, and repairable under pressures that would deform most known structures offers important clues for materials science, biotechnology, and medicine. Understanding how they protect and restore their DNA under these conditions can inspire new strategies against cellular damage at the surface, from techniques for preserving tissues to innovative approaches for treating diseases related to genetic stability. In a way, each giant cell on the trench floor acts as a natural laboratory where life tests solutions that have not yet been imagined on land. Despite the technological advances of recent decades, knowledge of this world remains fragmentary. Most of the data available on the deepest trenches comes from a very small number of dives and from automated cameras that record only tiny areas for short periods. On the floor of Challenger Deep, it is assumed that only microorganisms and invertebrates can withstand the extreme conditions, but even that statement rests on limited evidence. Humanity has almost never remained there long enough to claim anything with absolute certainty. This scarcity of observations turns the trench into a scientific territory filled with uncertainty. What other species, still undescribed, live on its walls and in its depressions? What biochemical mechanisms allow a cell to keep functioning under pressures of up to 16,000 pounds per square inch, temperatures near freezing, and total absence of light? What kinds of ecosystems form around chemical seepages that have not yet been detected? Each new dive, each camera deployed, each sediment sample collected adds a piece to a puzzle that is still almost blank. Another question remains open. To what extent human activity is beginning to alter this supposedly intact environment? Recent studies have detected microplastics and contaminant substances in deep living organisms, including amphipods collected in trenches. Although the reference document focuses on life and exploration, other research has shown that even in the most remote points of the ocean, products of modern industry and consumption slowly leak down to the bottom. The abyss, far from being a refuge untouched by our presence, is beginning to reveal the traces of the surface. At the same time, the prospect of economically exploiting the seafloor raises questions about the impact such activities could have on ecosystems that are barely understood. Any disturbance of the sediment, any modification of deep currents, or of the chemical sources that sustain chemosynthesis could trigger unpredictable effects in a very delicate ecological network. In an environment where processes are slow and regeneration can take centuries, damage would, in practice, be irreversible on a human timescale.